Good morning, everybody. I'm Jonathan Ossis with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. I am the Emerald Ash Borer Technical Assistance Coordinator. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for this Emerald Ash Borer informational meeting. This is a meeting held due to the recent new finds in parts of Carlton County, Meeker County, Murray County, Otter County, and Wadena County. So I am recording this, and we will make this presentation available on the Department of Ag's YouTube channel. I'll post a link on the MDA's EAB webpage in the next couple days after this meeting is over. So if you know anybody else that wasn't able to attend and that would benefit from this information, please feel free to send them to our website to be able to watch this at a later date. I'm going to give you a broad overview of Emerald Ash Borer and kind of go through all the different aspects, kind of just general life cycle, host trees, how to recognize symptoms, how to identify the insect, where it's known to be in the state currently, the regulations associated with it, management options for individual yard trees and in more landscaped areas, and how to report it. Also provide some resources if you are a forest landowner that may want to reach out to your area forester for coming up with a management plan if you have a lot of ash on your property. With that, I am going to go ahead and get started, and just remind you once again, it is being recorded, and we'll have time for questions after I'm done talking. Typically, it's about a 45-minute presentation, and just throw the questions in the chat or the Q&A as we go along, and I'll either answer them as we go or answer them at the end. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Emerald Ash Borer, like where it comes from, why it's such a big deal. Its native range is kind of northeastern Asia, so parts of China, Korean Peninsula, Japan, Russian Far East, and Taiwan. And so that's its native range. That's where it co-evolved with Manchurian ash and other ash species that are different from North American. And so it'll likely arrive sometime in the early 90s in Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario area through that port there. And so it likely arrived via solid wood packaging material. And it went undetected for, about a decade. So it wasn't until 2002 that it was first identified in Detroit, Michigan. And at that point, there were thousands of dead and dying ash trees kind of throughout that area. And what happened, due to the cryptic nature of this insect, that population built up and started causing widespread mortality. Lots of firewood and ash nursery stock got moved out of that area, kind of kicking off that rapid spread throughout North America. So we are now, I believe, at 37 or 38 states and 5 Canadian provinces with Emerald Ash Borer infestations. It's throughout much of the native range of North American ash, and it's now found in 58 or soon to be 59 counties in Minnesota out of 87. So we first found it in 2009 in St. Paul, Minnesota, and from there it's been spreading ever since. So it's going to impact everyone in the state eventually, and with that I'll go over the life cycle. And so our native ash trees don't have any natural host resistance, and we don't have that natural enemy complex to help keep the insect in check like it does in its native range. And so what we see is really high levels of mortality once Emerald Ash Borer shows up in a location. So the life cycle of this insect is important to understand, just to know what you're dealing with and how you might potentially spread it without knowing. And how to do management. So there's the adult active period and the inactive period. So the active period are when the beetles are out flying around. So right now here in the summertime, that's when the adult beetles are actively flying around and infesting new trees. So that time period is considered May through September. So we have that kind of broad range because emergence time in southern Minnesota compared to northern Minnesota can vary quite a bit. And we use growing degree day models to kind of forecast when the insects will begin emerging. So if you know anything about growing degree days, we use a base temperature of 50. And once we reach 450 growing degree days, that's when we get initial emergence. So in the southern half of Minnesota, that's typically, around the third week of May or the last week of May is when we kind of hit that temperature threshold. In northern Minnesota, a lot of times that's all the way into late June when we start to finally see emergence. So it can vary quite a bit. But so once those insects begin emerging from the trees, they do a little bit of maturation feeding in the canopy of the tree. So they feed on the leaves for a few days. It's you wouldn't notice this damage. They don't skeletonize the leaf or anything like that. So it's not something that you would notice, but they do that for a couple days before they then go and find a mate. And then once they mate, the females begin laying eggs in the bark cracks and crevices of ash trees. And they kind of start in the upper canopy of the tree and work their way down. So the average adult female beetle can lay anywhere from 60 to 90 EAB eggs. And so you can see, once that population starts to build, it can really hit that kind of exponential growth with how many eggs are being laid per beetle. And the beetles themselves aren't that long lived. They're out flying around for 30 or 40 days before they die. But it's really the larvae that are tunneling underneath the bark that do the damage to the tree. So once those EAB eggs are laid in the bark cracks and crevices, they hatch, and then they begin tunneling in that cambium layer of the tree. So that's where they do the damage. They disrupt the flow of water and nutrients between the root system and the crown, right there in that vascular system of the tree. And so the larvae go through what we call larval instar stages. And really, it's just growing sizes, and they go through 4 larval instars. And so as they tunnel and go through those larval instars, once they're done doing that, they then chew a pupal chamber, as you can see in that center picture, where they then fold over into what we call a J larva. So they're done doing the damage that they're going to do to the tree. And they usually chew that pupal chamber about 1/4 inch into the sapwood, or on large trees with really thick bark, they'll do that into the bark as well. At that point, the next spring and summer, when it heats up again, it will pupate, turn into the adult beetle, and start that process all over again. So what I just described is a 1-year life cycle. And in Minnesota, we have both a 1 and 2-year life cycle for this insect. So to give you a better idea what that means is an insect egg that was an emerald ash borer egg that was laid last summer, so the summer of 2024. It hatched, the larva began tunneling. It then made it partway through its larval instars and development, and it went dormant for the winter. This summer, it's going to continue tunneling until it makes its way to its pupal chamber. And then in the summer of 2026, when it heats up again, it will emerge as an adult beetle and start that process all over again. So you can really have any immature larval stage underneath the bark at any time of year, which is what that little chart at the bottom shows. And so that's just important to know, and that's the reason why firewood can be such a major issue for spreading this insect much further than it would on its own. So the adult beetles are okay flyers. They can fly several miles on their own, but the majority of the insects will reinfest a tree that not more than 100 meters from that they emerge from. So a lot of them will reinfest the same tree or a tree right next to it. It's just a small percentage of the population that strikes out longer distance and goes several miles. And so that's what helps create the satellite populations that kind of eventually coalesce into one large infestation. And with having that 2-year life cycle, you can have insects emerging from cut firewood well over a year after that tree was cut. All right. So kind of like I mentioned, how emerald ash borer kills a tree. A tree can withstand the attack of a few emerald ash borers, a few larvae tunneling around there in that cambium layer. It's really once the number of emerald ash borer that build up in a tree that kills the tree. So they can't withstand, hundreds of them or thousands of them, depending on the size of the tree. And so it really overwhelms the tree and eventually girdles it. And so this is also why the emerald ash borer starts in the top of the canopy and works its way down. If it started on the trunk of the tree, it would girdle that tree much faster and kill its food source. So it really makes use of all that living phloem in that tree and starts on the top and works its way down. And that's really how it kills the tree, eventually girdles it. And so the reason why it's such a big deal is this kind of EAB death curve that I'm showing right here. And so when emerald ash borer first gets to an area, those populations grow slowly at first, a lot of them in that 2-year life cycle. Sorry, I forgot to mention 2-year life cycles, about 50% in the southern half of Minnesota are in the 1 versus 2-year life cycle. And the further north you go, the higher percentage that are in that 2-year life cycle. And so when emerald ash borer populations are first getting started, they build slowly at first, but with each female beetle laying between 60 and 90 eggs, that begins to tick up. And then there's usually this couple-year lag time from when that population starts to explode and when you start to see widespread tree mortality in a given area. And so it's really, from when it first gets started in an area to about 12 to 15 years is what it takes to kill the majority of mature ash trees in an area. And this can be really overwhelming if you manage a large number of trees, say in right-of-ways, if you're a city managing trees, if you work for a streets department or something like that. You end up having a lot of trees die in a short amount of time, and you typically don't have the budget to deal with that many hazard trees. So it is really important to try to detect it early and to start implementing management early on in that curve so you can help slow down the rate at which trees die and at how long it takes to get to that point when you have that population explosion and widespread tree mortality. All right, so host trees. Really, it's all true ash trees. So anything in the Fraxinus species, and ash trees have opposite branching, compound leaves, and it's typically 5 to many leaflets on a leaf. We have 3 types of ash that are native to Minnesota. It's white ash, green ash, and black ash. And so here's just another picture of a green ash tree kind of showing that diamond-ridged bark. Sometimes ash trees can be confused with things like box elders and things like that, but they're very common. It's one of the most common trees planted in windrows, right-of-ways, in yards. It was commonly a replacement tree for elm trees that were killed by Dutch elm disease back in the 70s and 80s. So our communities have a lot of ash trees. The distribution throughout the state of Minnesota, you can find green ash throughout the entire state. It is some of the most common. It's, like I mentioned, the most common planted tree in yards and right-of-ways and boulevards and things like that. We have pockets of white ash in the more upland areas in certain parts of the eastern and southeastern part of the state. And then black ash is found throughout 2/3 of the state, much of that being in north central Minnesota, where we have these kind of large swaths of black ash swamp forest. And we have a huge amount of forest land made up of black ash. And Minnesota is a state with the largest ash resource in the lower 48. So we have nearly 1 billion ash trees throughout the state, much of that in black ash forest land. But additionally, besides that, much of our community forests have green ash make up a significant chunk of that, especially as you get out into more communities in the western part of the state. On average throughout the state, it's in a community, it's 1 out of every 5 trees is an ash tree. As you get into some smaller communities and in western Minnesota, a lot of times that's 1 out of every 2. Anywhere from 40 to 60% ash that make up the community forest. So it has a really big impact when this comes in and starts killing the trees in a relatively short amount of time. And as you can see on the susceptibility scale, black ash, green ash, and white ash is all very susceptible. In general, we've seen around a 98-99% mortality rate of mature ash as EAB works its way through. Black ash is the most susceptible. It takes the least amount of emerald ash borer per square meter of phloem to kill the tree, and next it's green ash and then white ash. Right. And just listed on the side, there are a number of different cultivars that you might see planted in your community or in your yard. I will mention there is a secondary host. It is called the white fringe tree. It's in the same family as ash, the olive family. It is not a preferred host, but emerald ash borer can complete its life cycle in it. It's not native to Minnesota, but you do see it sold at nurseries. So it is a small shrub that you can plant in your yard, an ornamental shrub. I would just suggest if you're looking for a new shrub to plant in your yard, don't plant the white fringe tree. All right, so how to recognize emerald ash borer? Really, it comes down, there's about 4 ways to confirm it. The number 1 way to identify it is that S-shaped feeding gallery. So the larvae make a very distinct tunneling pattern underneath the bark that is indicative of emerald ash borer. So if you find that S-shaped tunneling pattern in an ash tree, you know it's emerald ash borer. That is the only insect in ash that will make that tunneling pattern. And as you can see in that picture in the top left, you have those kind of tight S-shaped back and forth feeding pattern. And so it's pretty easy to spot. I'll show more images of how you might see it when you're looking at potential symptoms in a tree. But that is the most common way to identify the insect. And usually, if you have enough bark stripped away, you can see that S-shaped feeding pattern. Next up is the emerald ash borer larva itself. So it is also very distinct. If you pull an insect larva out of an ash tree, what you want to look for is if at the tail end of that larva, it has two little spine-like projections. It's called the urogophy. It's two little black pincers at the tail end of the larva. And if you have two of them on it, and it was pulled from an ash tree, you know it's emerald ash borer. We have other insects in ash trees that will have one of those or will have none of them. But if it has two little spine-like projections at the tail end, you know it's emerald ash borer if it was pulled from an ash tree. Third is the adult beetle itself. So, in heavily infested areas, you may see the adult beetles hanging out on the tree or flying, landing on something nearby. But typically early on in infestation, you're not going to see the adult beetles very much. They're usually up in the canopy of the tree and not really in a very visible area. I'll show you the insect that's most commonly confused with this right after this, but it is easy to identify. It's about a 1/2 inch long by about an 1/8 inch wide and has that kind of dark magenta colored abdomen with those bright iridescent green wing covers. So it is a very showy insect. It's very pretty, but it's not very big. It's, like I said, only about a 1/2 inch long by about an 1/8 inch wide. And with that, they do leave a distinct D-shaped exit hole when exiting trees. So that is indicative of emerald ash borer, but I will say that is probably the worst thing to look for when you're trying to identify infested trees. There are other insects that'll leave oval-shaped exit holes that can be somewhat confusing. And most importantly, if you're looking at a large ash tree with thick bark, a small D-shaped exit hole about an 1/8 of an inch wide is quite small and could take a tremendous amount of time to identify. And in addition to that, if you're seeing D-shaped exit holes at eye level, if you were to look up into the canopy of the tree, you would see a lot of other signs and symptoms that would let you know that that tree is infested besides that D-shaped exit hole that you can see. So while it is indicative of EAB, you're much better off looking for those S-shaped feeding galleries and the emerald ash borer larva itself. All right, and like I mentioned, these are the insects most commonly confused with emerald ash borer. You can see emerald ash borer up in the upper left that's circled there in yellow. Really, the most common one that we get is the six-spotted tiger beetle down there in the bottom right. That's a ground nesting beetle that a lot of people will see on their deck or their sidewalk or their driveway. It's quite fast, and they'll see this bright green insect run real fast past them, and they think they've seen emerald ash borer, but that's most commonly the six-spotted tiger beetle. Like I mentioned, emerald ash borer is typically up in the canopy of the tree, and you usually don't start to see the insect until you're in an area that's pretty heavily infested. All right, so signs and symptoms, the best things to look for when you're trying to identify emerald ash borer as early as possible. Unfortunately, emerald ash borer is a very cryptic insect, and you don't see symptoms in a tree until it's been present there for typically a couple years at least. And really, the number one thing that we look for when trying to identify new infestations is we look for woodpecker feeding damage. And so it gives off a pretty distinct look when they're going after emerald ash borer. And so where to start looking first, if you're trying to find it early, is in that mid to upper canopy in the branches between 2 to 6 inches in diameter, where that bark has just transitioned from smooth to rough. That's typically where the beetles begin to like to start laying their eggs. And they usually start doing that on the south or southwest facing side of the tree first. And so as emerald ash borer begins to build up in a tree, a lot of times woodpeckers will find that food source. And so they will begin going after the late instar larvae underneath the bark. And the woodpeckers will drill these kind of dime-sized, oval-shaped, light colored, because they're just going deep enough to get to the larva underneath the bark. So just between the bark and the surface of the wood. And so they leave these shallow woodpeck holes that a lot of times they'll scuff off or flake off and create blonding and create these little blonde patches in those branches between 2 to 6 inches in diameter up in that mid to upper canopy of the tree. And so the best time to look for this is in the wintertime. That's when we typically do a visual survey, when the leaves are off the tree, when you can see clearly up into the canopy of the tree. And it really helps to have a nice pair of binoculars as well. So really with your naked eye, you can scan the canopy for that blonding. And if you see these kind of light blonde colored patches, you need to look to see if there's actual woodpeck holes in those areas. Sometimes squirrels will run up and down a tree, or branches rub on a stem of a tree and create that blonding. But you really need to look for that woodpecker damage within those blonded areas, and look for that shallow woodpecking. That is indicative of there being an insect there, and a lot of times, if once you've seen enough examples, you can tell when it's emerald ash borer. And a lot of times, woodpeckers will take off enough bark to where you can actually see some of that S-shaped tunneling pattern on the surface of the wood in that woodpecked area. And so this is really the number one thing that we use to identify infested trees. So here's some more pictures. That image on the left is a green ash. You can see those little blonde patches kind of separated apart. And then if you look closely, there's these shallow woodpeck holes in those blonded areas. In the middle, it's kind of a low quality image, but that is a black ash. You can see the color of the bark is a little bit different. But then you still get some of that flaking and that blonding with those woodpecker holes in those locations. And then on the right is another green ash tree in a park that's heavily infested. And you can see some bark has been stripped off at the very base, showing lots of larval tunneling, that S-shaped tunneling pattern. Next up is bark splits. So, when that tree is initially infested, it will try to heal around that initial larval tunneling gallery. So it builds up callus tissue, trying to cordon off that wound. And as it continues to grow, that bark separates from the surface of the wood and creates a nice vertical split. And oftentimes you can see that larval tunneling pattern on the surface of the wood in between that bark split. So it can look a little bit different, just depending on the situation. It varies a little bit. But so you can see in these two images, the one on the left, you can see a bunch of callus tissue that's split in the bark, and you can see that tunneling pattern on the surface of the wood in that split. The picture on the right is a much more tight split, but you can see some of that tunneling on the surface of the wood in that vertical split. And so more examples of this, that picture on the left, all going up that main stem, you can see these long vertical splits. And if you were to look up closely, you would see parts of that S-shaped tunneling pattern. A lot of it cut off by the callus tissue that's growing around as well. But you can also see blonding on the bark with small woodpeck holes. And then the image on the right is a little bit tricky. Just if you can see that kind of a split forming in the center of the picture. But if you look up to the very top of the picture in the center, you can actually see part of a bark split with a gallery right there on the surface of the wood in the top center of that picture. So it can be pretty cryptic, but if you train your eyes, you can spot these things. Really, the number one thing, though, you want to look for is that blonding with the woodpecker damage. In addition to the woodpecker damage and the bark splits, there's also canopy thinning. So you see crown dieback. You see the tree dying from the top down. You see overall thinning of the canopy, so fewer leaves, smaller leaves, more light penetrating through that canopy. A lot of times you'll see that those water sprouts or epicormic sprouting in that lower part of the canopy along the main stem. So that image on the right is very typical of emerald ash borer and green ash trees, where you get this really thin canopy on the outside, and then you start getting a lot of sprouting on the main stem in the lower part of the canopy, creating that real bushy appearance. And if you were to go back and look at that tree, once the leaves have dropped, you'd be able to see a lot of blonding and woodpecker damage in the upper canopy of that tree. All right, so those are the general symptoms and what you should look for when you're trying to see if your tree might have emerald ash borer. And here's kind of the general progression of that. So this is on average. So on average, it takes about 5 years from emerald ash borer's initial infesting a tree to killing the tree. That can take a little bit longer if it's very early on in the infested area where emerald ash borer is just starting to build. Or it can take a little bit shorter, where say 3 or 4 years if you're in an area that's been infested for a while and there's a really high pest pressure in the area, tons of emerald ash borer flying around, you could kill a tree in as low as 3 to 4 years, depending on the size and health of the tree. But on average, it's about 5 years, initial infestation to tree death. And so in that first year of infestation, there's small larvae present. There are no symptoms in the tree that would let you know that that tree is infested. The only way to identify emerald ash borer in that first year of infestation is by doing what we call branch sampling. And that requires taking 2 to 3 foot sections of branch from the mid canopy and debarking it with a draw knife to look for those small larvae that might be present. And that still only gives you about a 70-75% chance of identifying it in that first year of infestation. In that second year of infestation, you have more emerald ash borer building up in the tree. If the woodpeckers found that food source, you might have a few woodpecks possible. This isn't going to be very obvious. There may be 1 or 2 branches with a few spots with blonding and a couple small woodpeck holes. If your tree was an otherwise pretty healthy tree before emerald ash borer reached it, you likely wouldn't see much of any canopy impacts at this point. It's really once you get into year 3, you have even more emerald ash borer building up in the tree. That's when you're likely to see woodpecking, and you may see some bark splits. And that's when, some of that crown dieback may begin. To the average homeowner, that may not be visible at that point either. The canopy still may look pretty healthy. It's really in year 4 that you can really see those canopy impacts. At that point, usually there's woodpecker damage coming down to almost eye level. And so it should be very obvious that there's something wrong with your tree at that point. And typically that difference between that year 3 and 4 is the difference between a tree that might be treatable with insecticide to one that is not. So even lightly infested trees are savable. It just, it's the general rule of thumb is, as long as you have 70% of a healthy canopy, that tree is still a candidate for treatment if you'd like to save it. It'll stop things where it's at, but I'll get into more of that later about insecticide options. And then, like I mentioned, by the time you get to years 5, 6, that tree is dead and on its way out. It's important to mention that ash trees dry out quickly and become hazardous. And it's important to try to deal with the tree if it's in an area where it could fall on damaged persons or property before it's fully dead. They dry out really quick and they begin to fail in unpredictable ways. If the tree's located next to your house, in your backyard, in a place where it might be difficult and you have to bring in bigger equipment to remove it, you definitely don't want to wait till it's fully dead, because that can really increase the cost of that removal. So dealing with the trees before they're completely dead is in your interest. It's cheaper, it's safer, it's all of those things. So you really don't want to wait if that tree is in a place where it could damage anything or hurt anybody. You don't want to wait till it's fully dead, because a lot of ash trees, within a couple years after they die, fail in unpredictable ways and do not stay standing. So that is an important thing to note. All right, so distribution in Minnesota. So the known distribution. Emerald ash borer is likely in more locations than what we have recorded, but this is our MDA EAB status map. Gets updated nightly with new infestations. I apologize for the coloring on the screen at the moment. But there's a few important things to note. So I'll just say at the top of the image, you can see the URL for accessing this map. If you're ever wondering where emerald ash borer has been confirmed in the state, please check this map. If you hear about locations that aren't being shown on this map, please report them to us. And I'll go more over how best to report things at the end of this presentation. So a couple things on this map. We have the emerald ash borer quarantine boundaries. So that's the red outline and shaded areas on this map. That is the emerald ash borer quarantine regulations that get put into place once emerald ash borer is found in a new area. And so that restricts the movement of any ash material and any hardwood firewood or mulch. And we do all hardwood firewood, and firewood's anything cut to 4 foot lengths or less, because the average person cannot tell what's in a cut pile of firewood. And that's one of the biggest way emerald ash borer gets spread long distance. And so you can move freely within the contiguous quarantine area. And then we have that green polygon layer on the map. And so that is the generally infested area. And that's probably the most important thing on this map to let you know. If you're within the generally infested area, there is a high likelihood that emerald ash borer is already impacting your trees, whether you see signs of infestation or not. Due to the cryptic nature of the insect, it's always spread beyond further than what you can see in an area. So the average spread rate of the insect without human-assisted movement is typically about 2 miles a year. So that's where the buffer starts. And so if you were to zoom in on this map, individual points would appear, but we have this buffer to better show where emerald ash borer is impacting trees, knowing that not everybody's going to report trees and it's impossible to record every tree that's reported. So and if you're within about 10 to 15 miles of that generally infested area, that's when you want to start thinking about treatment. So if you're within the generally infested area, you want to begin coming up with a management plan for your ash trees now, as you're likely beginning to be impacted by the insect. If you're within about 10 to 15 miles of those generally infested areas, you want to start thinking about treatment if that's something you want to do. If you have a high value tree you don't want to lose. It's hard to know exactly when emerald ash borer will show up in your neighborhood, in your area. It just because due to the random spread and that cryptic nature, it's hard to guess. So once you're within a reasonable distance of it, you want to start dealing with it. And if you're managing trees for a community somewhere in the state that it's not known to be yet, you should begin actively managing and coming up with a plan now. And I'll go over that a little bit more here in just a few minutes. So as we zoom into some of the new finds that we're here to talk about today, we have the finds in Murray County there in the southern part of the state. So I'm going to start from south and move north. So we had a find at a farm in Fulda, near Fulda, Minnesota, just north of Nobles County. So Worthington's down to the south there, and at the county fairgrounds in Slayton. There's a good chance it's in more locations than that, but those are the confirmed reports. So if you live in those areas, you should start planning for how you're going to deal with it as it begins to impact your trees. As we head north, the find in Meeker County was just south of town of Litchfield. So I believe it's on Round Lake at the boat launch there. It was identified. This area is pretty close to that advancing line of the bigger generally infested area coming out of the greater Twin Cities area, likely impacting more trees than what's being showed in this area. But that's where it's been identified, and it's beginning to start to show tree mortality in that area. And then other infestations nearby, you have stuff near Hutchinson to the south, and then to the northwest, you have the Spicer area in Candioi County. The next up is the find in Otter County and Wadena County. So it was found about 8 miles apart by a tree care service just south of the town of Deer Creek in Otter County. And then about 8 miles to the northeast in Wadena, just south of the downtown area. And so, at both those sites, there was, at least half a dozen trees identified. There's likely more going on in the area. So if you're in either of those counties, keep an eye out and report new infestations if you see it. And just with Otter County being such, cabin country, there's a larger potential for people moving wood from other areas that are already infested to their properties and kicking off infestations there. And lastly, there's a few new locations within Carlton County. You can see in that southeastern part and the eastern part, and then near the Fond du Lac Reservation in Sawyer, Minnesota as well. So those are the new locations that have popped up there. All right. So now I'm going to briefly touch on the regulations associated with it. I had mentioned what fire it is. And so here's the purpose of the quarantines. It's to reduce or eliminate the spread of a pest through human-assisted movement. So we're restricting pest movement while trying to facilitate trade and people's regular business routines. And so we have two types of quarantines for the pest. We have an internal quarantine that limits the movement between areas within the state. So, and we also have an external quarantine where we limit the movement of those regulated materials from out of state or out of country into Minnesota. So you can't be bringing firewood or ash material in from the Dakotas, Iowa, or Canada. And you can't be moving from a quarantine county to a non-quarantine county within the state. And so when we're talking about regulated articles, like I had mentioned, we're talking about any ash material. So any fraxinous species of wood, any stage of emerald ash borer, mulch, and hardwood firewood. I mentioned hardwood firewood is anything cut to 4-foot lengths or less of a hardwood species of tree. And that's due to people not being able to typically know what's in a cut pile of firewood. All right, so just pictures of what we regulate here. And so just the movement of regulated articles. So just to kind of show you what's allowed and what's not. You cannot bring wood in, any ash or firewood in from Canada without a compliance agreement or phytosanitary certificate, which would involve us, or North Dakota or places like that. Outside of the quarantine within the state, you can move wood freely. Within the quarantine, you can move any of those articles freely. That yellow arrow right there shows what we call transiting. So if you're starting in a non-quarantine county and your destination is a non-quarantine county, you are allowed to transit through the quarantine. You're not allowed to do overnights, so you can stop for lunch and things like that, but you have to move through that area. Once you bring those regulated articles into the quarantine area, they are then considered regulated if you're not just transiting. So you can bring any of those materials from a non-quarantine county into a quarantine county. They cannot then not move back out. And obviously you cannot bring any of those regulated articles from a quarantine area to a non-quarantine area. So red means stop, yellow means caution, green means you're good to go. And, if you have a business that needs to haul any of this regulated material out of the quarantine area, you'll have to work with the Department of Ag to get a compliance agreement. That usually involves doing one of these types of treatments that ensures that you're not potentially spreading emerald ash borer to a new location. So that typically is either, grinding it using a chipping up, making it 1 inch by 1 inch or less in 2 dimensions. That usually involves a tub grinder, so that can be spendy. You can debark it if you're going to work with that wood. Compost, heat treatment. We have a number of certified firewood dealers in the state that heat treat their wood, and that's just making it reach a certain temperature for a certain amount of time. Kiln dry and fumigation. So if you have a business that needs to haul any of that regulated material from a quarantine area to a non-quarantine area, you just have to reach out to the Department of Ag, and we can work with you to get a compliance agreement. And like I mentioned before, the definition of firewood, it's wood cut to lengths less than 4 feet long, split or not, whether it's for commercial or private use, and it's all hardwood species. And just to reiterate, firewood cannot enter from Canada or other states. It can't leave the EAB quarantine. And not pictured on this, it cannot leave the spongy moth quarantine as well. And that's a quarantine we have in Lake and Cook counties in the far northeastern part of the state due to spongy moth. That is a moth or a caterpillar that does a lot of damage in that area. So firewood can move around inside of the pest quarantine. It can move around outside of the quarantine, and it can move freely throughout the entire state if it's certified. And so firewood that's been certified has that MDA shield on the label, and that's safe to move anywhere throughout the state because it's been certified pest-free, and you can move it into state parks and things like that as well. If you have questions on the quarantine or comments on the emergency quarantine that has been put into place for all the new counties, please contact Mark Abrahamson. He's the state plant health regulatory official. His email is right there, so you can make any questions or comments to Mark, or you can put them into this meeting as well, and we can try to address them. And just to reiterate, firewood is such a vector for this. People, cut down trees in their yards, and they don't think about why that tree died, and then eventually move it up to their hunting or cabin property or take it with them camping somewhere. And not moving firewood is really what needs to happen, because besides emerald ash borer, other insects and things can be vectored through that pathway, and just get into the habit of buying firewood where you're going to burn it. So here's a piece of ash wood. There's no visible signs on the outside of it. You peel off the bark, there's an emerald ash borer gallery. Still no insect. You dig into that wood, there's that emerald ash borer J larva just waiting for it to be brought to a new location and to pupate and turn into the adult beetle and emerge in a new location. So it really why we have these large campaigns of not moving firewood and buying it where you're going to burn it, because this is a major vector. And it's why it showed up in, places like just outside Portland, Oregon, where it took, a 1,500-mile jump. It was moved to Boulder a number of years ago, and that was like an 800-mile jump. So it's a huge vector and a major pathway for spreading these forest pests. All right. So management. Um, Really, there's a few options available. It comes down to treatment and removal. We have our best management practices. So the Emerald Ash Borer active period, like I mentioned, is May 1st through September 30th. If you can avoid it, avoid removal of ash trees, doing pruning, anything like that in that active period. Uh, that's due to the insect being able to emerge from that wood if you have to haul it to a disposal site to be processed. You could, if you have to, if you're on one side of the county and you move it to the other side of the county, there may not be an infestation yet in that part of the county. You could be spreading it that way. Like I mentioned, emerald ash borer will often reinfest the same tree or a tree next to it. So by waiting until that dormant period, you let as much EAB build up in that tree as possible, and then you remove it when it's not active, and you can destroy that material before you reach the flight season the following year. So that's why we strongly encourage doing the pruning and removal of ash as desired from October through April. And that's due to those reasons. If you have, I mean, obviously we have storms and things like that. You have to deal with ash trees in the summertime. If you can ship it on site or leave the wood at that site, or at least cover the load as you move it to wherever it's going to be processed. Once you're in a more heavily infested area, this becomes less important as emerald ash borer is more spread throughout the entire area. Then it just becomes pertinent to be able to get down hazard trees in a timely fashion. So that should take top priority. All right. So options for management. Really, you have removals. So you can begin removing trees if you're a community or a county managing a large number of trees in a public right of way. You may want to start removing some ash trees before emerald ash borer even arrives. So identifying poor quality trees, poorly sited trees to help reduce that overall, amount of ash that you have in your inventory. Um, it's good to start if you can before it actually arrives, just because due to that, that death curve, you end up having a lot of trees die in a short amount of time. That really stresses your resources. Trees with woodpecker damage. So if you're a community that emerald ash borer has just been found, in the wintertime, going through and identifying trees that show that obvious signs of that blonding with the woodpecker damage, that's a good way to prioritize trees to be removed, because trees showing that damage has more emerald ash borer in it than a tree nearby that shows no signs of those symptoms. And then obviously dealing with dead trees that are hazardous and could potentially hurt persons or property. In more natural areas, you can let the trees just die and fall apart. And then there's treatments. And so you can do that before emerald ash borer arrives. So, once you're within, 10 or 15 miles of a known infestation, that's if you want no risk to your trees, that's when you want to start treating. And you can also begin treating after that tree is lightly infested. Like I mentioned, you can have, as long as your tree has 70% of a healthy canopy or more, that tree is a good candidate to be treated. Technically, the chemical still works on trees that are at least 50%, of canopy or more. But a half dead tree does not look very visual appealing, and that's likely a lot more damage than it's probably not worth investing in treatment at that point for that tree, unless it's part of a community, like a city plan for trying to manage the insect. Treatments are a good way to manage local populations. You can reduce the rate at which trees die and untreated trees next to it by having treated trees in the landscape. It's just one thing to think about when you're thinking about management for a large amount of trees. And so, like I mentioned, what you want to think about when you're deciding whether to remove or treat: how close is emerald ash borer known to be? Is it in your town? Is it nearby? Or is it not in your county yet? How healthy are your trees? Are they in good condition? Are they quality trees, mature trees that are giving a lot of benefits? Like how large are those trees? Smaller trees are typically a lot cheaper to cut down and replace, and get something new growing. And then how many trees do you have to manage? So maybe structured removals, knowing you're going to do so many removals each year, or treating a certain number of them, and trying to slow the rate at which the untreated trees die. Sometimes communities will, not necessarily treat the tree for the life of the tree, but do it, you know, have say a 10 to 15 year period where they do treatments, just to draw out the amount of time and give them kind of be able to have control of the rate at which they have to remove trees. With emerald ash borer, when the populations explode, you have a lot of trees die in like a 5 year period. That can be really difficult to manage, and can be extremely expensive. So that's another thing to think about. If you want your tree protected, you have to treat the tree for the life of the tree. Emerald ash borer will persist in the landscape. It's not going away. So if you want to make sure your tree continues to be healthy, you have to follow the treatment guidelines. And so there's a number of systemic insecticides that are available to treat ash trees. A couple of the main ones are things like emamectin benzoate and imidacloprid. The ones most often available to your average homeowner that you can buy at your local garden store are typically a soil drench, are applied via soil drench, and are good for 1 year. And then it's, what most tree care professionals use for mature trees is the chemical emamectin benzoate, and that's injected directly into the tree near that root flare. And so it's pumped into the tree, and then that's guaranteed for 2 years, and somewhat effective in the third. But if you want to make sure there's no damage to your tree, you need to follow that 2 year reapplication timeline. It's important to mention that you really need to measure your tree and follow the label on the insecticide that you're applying. And they need to be repeated for the life of the tree, as long as you want to keep it protected. Some of the treatment options available to the average homeowner sometimes aren't rated for really large mature trees. So we really recommend, if you have a mature tree that you want to save, to contact a professional and have it professionally treated. That emamectin benzoate chemical is a restricted use pesticide, and most formulations of it are only available to licensed pesticide applicators. So really encourage you to contact an arborist, a local tree care professional, if you want to treat a large mature tree, and ensure that it's properly treated and the tree is healthy enough to be treated. And just to give kind of a picture of what a treatable versus non-treatable tree is, the tree on the left is in good condition. That's a good candidate for treatment. The tree in the middle is in fair condition and still a reasonable candidate for treatment, should you do just fine. That tree on the right is kind of past that 30% and is not a good candidate for treatment. It's also important to remember that management priorities change as you move from an uninfested area to a heavily infested area. So when you're in an not known to be infested area, detecting and reporting possible infestations, and planning and having an ash inventory. So knowing what the resource is that you have is very important. So you know what resources you need to adequately deal with it. And the earlier you can detect it, the better off you'll be in spreading out the costs of the damage of this insect over a longer period of time. Once you move into that kind of generally infested area, you treat high value trees that you want to keep around, and have timely sanitation and removal of infested trees and destroying that material. And once that emerald ash borer population explodes and you're seeing lots of tree mortality, you're really just trying to minimize wood movement and have safe disposal and utilization of that wood. And next are some resources that are available from DNR Forestry. So there is a DNR Forest Stewardship Program, and they advise private forest landowners on forest management. So they have access to cost share programs if you come up with a management plan and are going to implement certain things on your woodland property. Contact the DNR Forest Stewardship Program if you have questions about that. I think to qualify for any of those programs, you have to have at least 10 acres of woodland. And then there's the DNR Urban and Community Forestry Program. They are typically the program that has money to grant out to communities to help manage and prepare for this insect. They typically have 1 or 2 grants available per year. It just kind of depends. Visit their website, their community grants website. They have all their stuff posted there, and even if they don't have a current program, which I don't think they have a current grant opportunity available at the moment, they may in the near future, and you can look at previous grant cycles and those applications to get a good idea of what they're going to be looking for when you apply for that. And then there's also the forester contact map for your areas, community and private forestry. You can visit that map to find the appropriate contact for your area. All right, and then lastly, reporting. So if you think you found emerald ash borer, please report it to us. Please take pictures. We really depend on having pictures and a very accurate location of where you observe this. You can report it to a local city forester. If you have EDMAPS, that's an invasive species reporting system. You can report any invasive species through that app. Otherwise, contact the Department of Ag's Report a Pest. We have an online form, we have an email, or we have a voicemail. Like I said, I really encourage taking pictures. Take pictures of the symptoms that you're seeing, not just a zoomed out picture of a crappy looking tree. Take a picture of the woodpecker damage or the insect tunneling or the insect itself that you found, and send that in with the report. And please be very descriptive and accurate with the location that you're reporting it from. All right, so that is all I have for you. Thank you, and now I'll move on to questions. All right, so the first question, is there an age or size where ash trees become susceptible to EAB? Pretty much they can infest anything down to an inch in diameter. So obviously they don't typically go after those really young trees. It's really, once you start getting into that 3 or 4 inch diameter range where it's going to get attacked. So they can go down to pretty small sizes. All right, next question. In Otter County, what regulations do tree service providers follow to dispose of infested wood within the county? Can homeowners expect a surcharge fee for disposal? I honestly can't speak to that. That is up to county regulations. I don't know if they have any. So, our quarantine boundary is at the county level. So they are free to move within that. It's up to the county if they want to require anything smaller than that and not to be moved throughout all of the county. So that is really up to the county, and I don't have the answers for that, unfortunately. I'm not sure about a surcharge fee as well for disposal. I know in the metro area where wood waste is becoming a much bigger issue, there are being larger surcharge fees for disposal of wood in the metro just due to the higher costs for the tree care companies disposing it for residents. All right. Next question. We have an ash tree that looks sick, dead this spring that was healthy last year. It eventually leafed out, but very thin. Could this be lawn chemicals, spring weather, or EAB? Well, from the sound of it, it sounds like it could be lawn chemicals, or if it had anthracnose last year, that's something that'll make the leaves drop and eventually come back. I would look for those that woodpecker damage in the canopy of the tree to look for those signs of infestation. That's really going to be what tells you if you have EAB or not. And once you really start to see that crown dieback. So usually by the time your canopy is really thin, you start to see that woodpecker damage as well. All right. Any other questions? And I didn't go over cold hardiness. It's just important to note that, while cold can help reduce populations in a given winter, it will not get rid of the issue. And so emerald ash borer really takes down to -30°F underneath the bark. And there's usually a bit of a buffer from the outdoor temperature to below the bark, and there's a lot of microsite climatic factors. It won't get rid of the problem, and it'll still build the tree killing levels. Is the basics of that. So while EAB can help reduce populations in a given winter, it does not do what we need it to do, and it will still get the tree killing levels. I have a question. Matthew, 1 second here. All right, Matthew, I've unmuted you.
Okay, so I was just curious. I just saw the recent map, and there are some spots here in Itasca County near Lake
Yes.
Pokegama. What determines quarantine status? So I'm curious about those next steps.
So that is really just because of the recent July 4th holiday. It was reported right before that. That will be announced. We'll have an emergency quarantine announced in the next couple of weeks. Gotcha. So we are starting to talk to stakeholders to come up with an emergency quarantine boundary. It's usually the county, but sometimes in areas with a much larger ash resource, it's limited, and depending on the industry as well in the area. So
okay, I appreciate that, because I work for the SWCD, and so part of our job is outreach, and so I'm not sure exactly at what point do I want to broadcast this out to our current, our stakeholders.
Yep. So the county is aware of it, and I let the city of Grand Rapids know, but there will be an actual press release going out in the next week and a half or so.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Oh, okay. All right. So let's see. In the winter, would it be helpful to remove snow around ash trees to reduce populations? I don't know how big an impact that's going to have. Yeah, snow could definitely insulate it some, especially, but how high is that snowpack? The majority of the damage is going to be above that level anyways. By the time it's already down to that level, it's, going to be a heavily infested tree. Yeah. Is there a method to season infested ash to reduce future EAB infestations other than expensive mechanical means? If you're holding ash logs on your property, you can tarp it, but really, destroying the wood, burning it, and whatnot is the best option for reducing future populations in an area. All right, great questions, everybody. Anything else? All right. Well, like I mentioned, this was recorded, and we will make it available on MDA's YouTube channel. Thanks for attending, everybody, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions at any point in the future here. Thanks.